On a night when the desert roars with relentless winds, a wounded man with no memory collapses at the doorstep of Nefret, a humble peasant woman. Moved by compassion, she risks everything to save him, unaware that he is, in truth, the pharaoh himself. She hides him in her modest hut, and beneath the cover of night, through whispered words, furtive glances, and long-buried secrets, a forbidden bond begins to form. But when the truth is revealed, they find themselves ensnared in a web of palace intrigues and deadly betrayals that threaten to tear them apart forever. Between duty and desire, between the crown and his heart, Seti must defy not only his enemies, but an entire kingdom to claim the one woman he was never meant to love. The blistering winds howled across the vast desert plains, carrying with them waves of golden sand that stung like 1,000 tiny needles against exposed skin. Nefret pulled her worn linen shawl tighter around her face, squinting through the narrow opening she'd left for her eyes. She'd been gathering herbs along the outskirts of her village when the storm struck, suddenly and with a fury that seemed almost personal. "Spirits above," she muttered, her voice muffled against the fabric. "Just let me make it home." At 42, Nefret had weathered many desert storms before. The daughter of a healer, she'd inherited not only her mother's knowledge of medicinal plants, but also her stubborn resilience. The villagers often remarked that she must have been blessed by the goddess Sekhmet herself, for she possessed both the healing touch and the fierce determination of the lioness deity. The storm intensified, the wind shrieking like the souls of the damned in the underworld. Nefret knew she'd never make it back to the village in these conditions. She'd have to find shelter and wait it out. Through the swirling veil of sand, she spotted the dark mouth of a small cave in the rocky outcropping ahead, a sanctuary, if only temporary. She stumbled forward, one arm raised before her face, feet sinking into the shifting dunes with each labored step. The weight of her herb pouch pulled at her shoulder, but she wouldn't abandon her precious cargo. These plants might be someone's only chance at healing before the next moon. Almost there, she encouraged herself, a habit formed from years of living alone. Just a little further. As Nefret neared the cave entrance, something caught her attention, a dark shape half buried in the sand, too large and oddly shaped to be a rock. The wind shifted momentarily, clearing the air just enough for her to see what it was. "Great Isis!" she gasped, rushing forward despite her exhaustion. A man lay face down in the sand, his fine linen garments torn and blood-stained, partially covered by the encroaching dunes. With strength born of desperation, Nefret grasped his shoulders and turned him over, brushing away the sand from his face. His features were unlike any she'd seen in their village, noble with high cheekbones and a strong jaw, now slack in unconsciousness. His skin, though darkened by the sun, was lighter than most who lived in these parts. Around his neck hung a peculiar amulet, half hidden beneath his collar, gleaming gold despite the layer of grit covering it. "Can you hear me?" she called, leaning close to his face, feeling for breath against her cheek. A faint warmth touched her skin. He lived, if barely. With determination that defied her modest frame, Nefret dragged the man toward the cave, inch by precious inch. The sandstorm continued its assault, as if trying to reclaim this stranger for itself. By the time she pulled him into the shelter of the cave, her muscles screamed in protest, and her breath came in ragged gasps. "You're safe now," she told the unconscious man, though she wasn't sure if those words were for him or for herself. The cave was cool and mercifully quiet after the howling chaos outside. Nefret gathered what little dry brush she could find near the entrance and, using flint from her pouch, managed to start a small fire. In its flickering light, she finally got a proper look at the stranger. His wounds were numerous but not life-threatening. A deep gash on his temple, bruises blooming across his chest, visible through his torn garments, and several cuts on his arms and legs. But it was the quality of his clothing that gave her pause. Even damaged, the linen was finer than any she'd ever touched, and the gold thread embroidery spoke of wealth beyond imagination. "Who are you?" she whispered, carefully cleaning his wounds with water from her small clay flask. "And what were you doing alone in the desert?" As if in response to her question, the man stirred, his eyelids fluttering. When they opened, Nefret found herself staring into eyes so dark and intense, they seemed to contain the night sky itself. He tried to speak, but only a dry croak emerged from his parched lips. Nefret quickly brought her flask to his mouth. "Drink slowly," she instructed, supporting his head. He obeyed, taking small sips before collapsing back in exhaustion. His eyes never left her face, filled with confusion and something that might have been fear. "You're safe," she repeated more firmly this time. "I found you in the storm. You're hurt, but you'll live." "Where?" he managed, his voice hoarse but carrying an unmistakable note of command despite his weakened state. "We're in a cave waiting out the sandstorm," Nefret explained. "My village is about an hour's walk from here. Once the storm passes, I can take you there." He shook his head slightly, wincing at the movement. "No, I mean, where is this place? What land?" Nefret frowned. "This is the eastern province, near the Great River." When his expression remained blank, she added, "The Kingdom of Egypt." Something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, but not the relief she expected. Instead, fresh anxiety seemed to grip him. "And you are?" he asked, attempting to sit up before pain forced him back down. "My name is Nefret. I'm a healer from the village of Heka." "Nefret," he repeated, as if testing how the name felt on his tongue. Then, with growing distress, "And I am?" The question hung between them in the flickering firelight. Nefret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cave's cool air. "You don't remember your own name?" she asked gently. Panic flashed across his features as his hand moved frantically across his body, as if searching for something. I can't remember anything." "Why can't I remember?" Nefret placed a calming hand on his shoulder. "Be still. You've taken a blow to the head. Memory loss can happen, but it often returns in time." "How much time?" There was that commanding tone again, at odds with his vulnerable state. "That depends on the person and the injury," she replied honestly. "Sometimes days, sometimes months. For some—" She hesitated. "Never," he finished for her, his jaw tightening. They sat in silence for a moment, the only sounds the crackling of the small fire and the muffled howling of the storm outside. "Your clothes," Nefret finally said. "They're of fine quality. You must be a person of importance, perhaps a merchant or a noble from the capital." The man looked down at his torn garments, as if seeing them for the first time. His fingers traced the gold embroidery along one edge, then moved to the amulet around his neck. When he pulled it out to examine it, Nefret caught her breath. It was a cartouche, the oval-shaped frame used to encircle the names of royalty. The hieroglyphs inside were partially obscured by dirt, but unmistakable to anyone who had seen royal declarations posted in the village. "You can read this?" he asked, noticing her reaction. Nefret hesitated. Her father had taught her to read basic hieroglyphs, unusual for a village woman, but he'd believed knowledge was a form of protection. "Some of it," she admitted. "It's a royal seal, but I cannot make out the name. It might not be yours. Perhaps it was given to you by someone at court." He frowned, running his thumb over the symbols, as if hoping they might speak directly to his soul. "Nothing feels familiar. It's like looking at someone else's possessions." "The sandstorm is beginning to quiet," Nefret observed, hearing the wind's fury diminishing. "When it's safe, we should go to my village. You need rest and proper care for those wounds. And if someone is looking for me—" There was a strange note in his voice, not hope, but wariness. "Then we will find them," Nefret assured him, though something in her gut twisted with unease. Why would a man of obvious wealth and status be alone in the desert, wounded and without escort? As the storm finally died away, Nefret helped the stranger to his feet. He was taller than she'd realized, and despite his injuries, carried himself with a natural dignity that seemed bone deep. Whoever he was accustomed to being respected. "Lean on me," she instructed, positioning herself under his arm. "It's not far, but the terrain is difficult." He hesitated, looking out at the vast desert now revealed under the setting sun. For a moment, Nefret thought he might refuse her help, might choose another direction entirely. "I don't even know which way I was headed," he finally said, his voice barely audible, "or what I was running from." "Sometimes," Nefret replied, surprising herself with the wisdom of her own words, "we find ourselves exactly where we're meant to be, even when the journey makes no sense." The stranger looked down at her, really seeing her for the first time. A slight smile, the first she'd witnessed, softened his imperial features. "Then I will trust your path, Nefret of Heka," he said, placing his arm across her shoulders. Together they stepped out into the desert twilight, the dying sun painting the dunes in shades of gold and crimson. Behind them, their footprints filled with sand, erasing the evidence of their shelter. Ahead, the first evening star appeared, guiding them toward the village where neither of them could possibly imagine the extraordinary events their chance meeting would set in motion. As they walked, the stranger occasionally touched the royal cartouche at his throat, his fingers tracing the hieroglyphs as if willing them to reveal their secrets. Nefret watched him from the corner of her eye, a strange mixture of concern and fascination growing within her heart. Something told her that this man's identity, once revealed, would change everything, not just for him but for her as well. The village lights appeared on the horizon, tiny beacons of warmth in the gathering darkness. Soon they would be among others, and the quiet intimacy of their cave sanctuary would be lost. For reasons she couldn't explain, Nefret found herself slowing their pace, savoring these final moments before the world rushed in to claim them both. 3 days had passed since Nefret brought the mysterious stranger to her modest mud-brick home on the outskirts of the village. 3 days of whispers and sideways glances from her neighbors, of tending wounds that healed with remarkable speed, and of watching his restless sleep as nightmares gripped him in the darkness. "You're getting stronger," Nefret observed, replacing the herb-soaked bandage on his temple with a fresh one. The morning light streamed through the small window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air between them. "Soon you'll be able to walk through the village without my support." The man, who still had no name they could call him, flexed his arm experimentally. The bruises had faded from angry purple to yellowish green, healing faster than Nefret thought possible. There was something about his constitution that seemed almost divine. "Thanks to your care," he replied, his deep voice no longer raspy from thirst and exhaustion. "I'm in your debt, Nefret." She waved away his gratitude with calloused hands. Any decent person would have done the same. Would they? His gaze was penetrating, as if he could see through her practiced humility to something deeper. "Your fellow villagers don't seem to share your openness. They look at me as if I might bring a plague upon them." Nefret couldn't deny it. The village elders had been suspicious from the moment she'd stumbled through the settlement boundary, supporting the half-conscious stranger. Their whispers followed her through the marketplace, speculations about where he'd come from, why he'd been alone in the desert, and most worryingly, whether soldiers would come looking for him. "They're cautious by nature," she said, busying herself with grinding herbs in her mother's old mortar. The familiar, rhythmic motion had always soothed her. "We rarely see outsiders here, especially ones dressed as finely as you were." He glanced down at the simple linen kilt he now wore, donated reluctantly by the village headman's son. His original garments, though cleaned of blood, were too distinctive and damaged to wear. "These clothes feel wrong," he murmured, more to himself than to her, "like they belong on someone else's body." Nefret paused her grinding, struck again by the nobility in his bearing. Even in humble village clothing, he somehow looked like a falcon among sparrows. "Do you remember anything more?" she asked gently. She'd learned to approach the subject carefully, as his frustration at the blank spaces in his mind could quickly turn to anger. He closed his eyes, his brow furrowing in concentration. Fragments, like looking through sheets of gauze at someone else's life. Nefret set aside her work and sat beside him on the reed mat that served as her guest bed. "Tell me what you see, even if it doesn't make sense. Sometimes speaking the pieces aloud helps connect them." He took a deep breath, his hands resting on his knees, fingers slightly curled as if holding something invisible. "Water," he began slowly. "Not the river, but contained. A pool perhaps, with lotus flowers floating on the surface. White pillars. Music." His fingers twitched, mimicking the plucking of strings. "A woman's laughter. That sounds like a palace," Nefret suggested. "Perhaps you were a musician or a scribe there." His eyes flew open, suddenly sharp with certainty. "No, not a servant." The vehemence in his voice startled her. I was... But the memory slipped away like water through cupped hands, leaving him frustrated once more. He clenched his fists and exhaled slowly. "You can't force it," Nefret said, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "The memories will return in their own time." That evening, as the setting sun painted her humble home in shades of amber and gold, they shared a simple meal of flatbread, lentils, and dried dates. The stranger ate with impeccable manners that seemed instinctive rather than learned, another clue to his origins. "This morning," he said suddenly, breaking their companionable silence, "I dreamt of a room. The walls were covered in paintings, hunting scenes, offerings to the gods. The ceiling was blue like the sky with golden stars." Nefret paused, a date halfway to her lips. "That sounds like a tomb chamber." He shook his head. "No, it was full of life. People coming and going, speaking to me." He stopped abruptly, his eyes widening. "They were bowing. Before speaking to me, they would bow." A chill ran down Nefret's spine. She had suspected her guest was a man of importance, but this suggested something far beyond a wealthy merchant or noble. What else? She prompted, trying to keep her voice casual. He reached for the royal cartouche he still wore beneath his borrowed shirt. There was a man there older, with a shaved head and leopard skin draped over his shoulders. A high priest, Nefret whispered, her suspicions growing. He was angry about something I'd decided, the stranger continued, his gaze distant now, seeing into a past that was slowly taking shape. He said it went against tradition, that my father would never have allowed such changes. Nefret's throat went dry. Your father, was he also obeyed like you were? The stranger's hand moved to his forehead, as if physically trying to pull the memories forward. Yes, I think so. And when he was gone, there was a ceremony, so elaborate, so heavy. His hands pantomimed something being placed on his head. A crown, Nefret breathed, almost inaudibly. Before she could process the implications, a commotion outside drew their attention. Voices, urgent and alarmed, carried through the village. Nefret rose quickly and went to her door, peering out into the gathering darkness. Torchlight approached from the west, where the road led toward the capital. Her elderly neighbor, Imhotep, hobbled toward her home as fast as his aged legs could carry him. Nefret, he called, his voice thin with anxiety. Soldiers! Royal soldiers on the road! She felt the blood drain from her face. Behind her, the stranger had risen to his feet, suddenly alert like a desert predator sensing danger. How many? She asked, stepping outside to meet Imhotep. A full squadron, the old man replied, glancing nervously at the doorway where her guest now stood. Led by a commander in a gold-trimmed cloak, they're stopping at every village, searching homes. Searching for what? Nefret asked, though in her heart she already knew the answer. Imhotep leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. For the missing pharaoh. The word hung in the air, like the aftershock of a thunderclap. Nefret turned slowly to face her guest, whose expression had transformed from alert caution to something unreadable. Pharaoh, he repeated, the word seeming to echo in the small space between them. He reached again for the cartouche at his throat, his fingers tracing the hieroglyphs with new understanding. A fragment of memory flashed across his features, recognition, realization, and something darker, fear. They're looking for me, he said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions behind his eyes. But I don't know if they come as rescuers or executioners. Nefret glanced back at the distant torches, now moving methodically from house to house at the village entrance. They had little time. What do you remember? She pressed urgently. Why would you be in danger from your own guards? He closed his eyes, concentration etched into every line of his face. A ceremony, a cup of wine. Faces I trusted smiling as I drank. His eyes snapped open. Poison. I tasted it too late. I remember running, taking a horse, fleeing into the desert before the poison could fully take hold. That's why you were alone, Nefret realized. You were escaping an assassination attempt. He nodded slowly, memories continuing to surface. There was a plot, whispers I ignored until it was nearly too late. The high priest, and someone close to me. He struggled, the word just beyond his grasp. Your vizier, Nefret suggested, remembering the tales of court intrigue that occasionally reached even their remote village. Rashidi, the name burst from him like water from a broken dam. Vizier Rashidi. He smiled the widest as he handed me the ceremonial cup. The sounds of the search grew closer, commands being shouted, doors being opened, children crying in fear. We have to hide you, Nefret decided quickly. If what you remember is true, those soldiers might not be looking to rescue their pharaoh, but to finish what the poison began. No, he said, straightening to his full height. In that moment, despite the simple clothes and healing wounds, Nefret could finally see it. The unmistakable aura of royal authority that no disguise could fully conceal. No more hiding. Too many pieces have returned now. But you still don't remember everything, Nefret protested. So your own name comes back to me now, he interrupted, his voice resonating with newfound certainty. His fingers traced the hieroglyphs on his cartouche one last time, but now with recognition instead of confusion. I am Seti, son of Amenhotep, lord of the Two Lands. The name struck Nefret like a physical blow. She found herself instinctively sinking to her knees, head bowed in the presence of divine royalty. My pharaoh, she whispered, overwhelmed by the realization that she had been sheltering, feeding, and treating the living god-king of Egypt as if he were an ordinary man. Rise, Nefret, Seti commanded gently, extending his hand to her. When she hesitated, he added more firmly, You did not kneel to me when I was nameless. Do not start now when I have merely remembered who I am." Uncertainly, she took his offered hand and returned to her feet. Outside, the soldiers' torches were now just 2 houses away. "What will you do?" she asked. Seti's expression hardened, years of royal training emerging through the fog of his partial amnesia. "First, I must determine if these soldiers are loyal to me or to the traitors who sought my death." He moved to the small wooden chest where his original clothing had been stored. Though damaged, the royal insignia would be unmistakable proof of his identity. "And then?" Nefret asked, helping him unfold the blood-stained but still magnificent garment. Seti's eyes gleamed with a dangerous light that reminded Nefret why pharaohs were associated with the falcon: beautiful, majestic, and lethal. "Then I reclaim my throne," he said simply, "and bring justice to those who would have usurped it." As he slipped the royal garment over his borrowed clothing, the transformation was complete. No longer was he the vulnerable, confused man she had dragged from the desert. Before her stood Pharaoh Seti, Lord of the Two Lands, his face a mask of regal determination. A pounding at her door announced that the soldiers had reached her home. Nefret looked to Seti, who gave a slight nod. "One moment more," he said, his voice now pitched to command rather than request. "There is something you should know, Nefret of Heka, before that door opens and everything changes." "My pharaoh?" she questioned, her heart racing with fear and something else she dared not name. "Whatever happens next," Seti said, reaching out to briefly touch her cheek with a gentleness that belied his royal demeanor, "know that you saved more than a nameless stranger in that desert. You saved Egypt itself, and I will not forget it." The pounding came again, more insistent. Voices demanded entry in the name of the pharaoh. Nefret took a deep breath, steadying herself for whatever was to come. As she moved toward the door, she cast one last glance at the man who had slept under her roof, eaten at her table, and spoken to her as an equal. A man who now stood as distant as the stars, wrapped in the mantle of divine kingship. Yet something in his eyes, something that recognized her as the first person who had seen him as simply human, gave her courage as she reached for the door latch, preparing to face whatever fate the gods had woven for them both. The royal soldiers' torches cast long, flickering shadows across the dusty village square. Their polished bronze spear tips glinted menacingly in the firelight as they formed a perimeter around Nefret's humble dwelling. Villagers gathered at a safe distance, their faces masks of fear and fascination at the unprecedented military presence in their remote settlement. Commander Amenemhat, resplendent in his gold-trimmed cloak that marked him as a member of the pharaoh's personal guard, stepped forward as Nefret cautiously opened her door. His hard-edged face, weathered by years of desert campaigns, betrayed no emotion, but his eyes darted quickly past her to scan the interior of her small home. "Woman," he addressed her with the casual disregard of a high-ranking official speaking to a provincial nobody, "by order of the royal court, we are conducting a search of all dwellings in the region. You will step aside." Nefret felt her heart hammering against her ribs. Behind her, Seti remained in the shadows, his identity concealed for these crucial moments while they assessed the soldiers' true purpose. "My home is humble, Commander," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "What could possibly interest the pharaoh's guard here?" Amenemhat's expression darkened at what he perceived as impertinence. "That is not your concern. Move aside or be moved." 2 soldiers advanced, prepared to forcibly remove her from the doorway. Nefret's mind raced. If these men were loyal to the conspirators, revealing Seti's presence could mean death for them both. But if they were truly searching for their missing king— Wait, she raised her hands in a placating gesture. "Before you enter, tell me, whom do you serve? Who sent you to search these villages?" The commander's patience evaporated. "I serve Egypt and its rightful ruler. Now stand aside." "And who?" came a commanding voice from within the dwelling. "Is Egypt's rightful ruler Commander Amenemhat?" The effect was immediate. The commander froze, his eyes widening in disbelief. The soldiers, trained to react to the voice of authority, instinctively straightened their postures. Seti stepped forward into the torchlight, the golden threads of his damaged royal garment catching the flames. Despite the dried bloodstains and torn fabric, the royal insignia was unmistakable. He moved with deliberate grace, positioning himself slightly in front of Nefret, a subtle but clear gesture of protection. My pharaoh?" Amenemhat's voice faltered, his disciplined facade cracking to reveal naked shock. "Is it truly you?" "It is," Seti confirmed, his voice carrying the weight of generations of divine rule. "Though it seems you had not expected to find me alive, Commander." The accusation hung in the air. Around them, the villagers who had been watching from a distance began to sink to their knees, foreheads touching the ground in the presence of their living god. Whispers rippled through the crowd. The pharaoh here in their village. Amenemhat immediately dropped to one knee, pressing his fist to his heart in the military salute. Great one, we have been searching for you for 7 days. When you disappeared from the palace, we feared the worst. Did you? Seti's tone remained neutral, revealing nothing of his suspicions. Rise, Commander, and tell me exactly who dispatched this search party. The commander stood, his expression earnest. It was High Priest Nachtmin who first raised the alarm, Divine One. He found signs of struggle in your chambers and blood upon your bedsheets. Vizier Rashidi then ordered all available forces to search the kingdom. Nefret noticed Seti's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly at the mention of Rashidi, the very man he remembered offering him the poisoned wine. And what were your orders upon finding me? Seti pressed, his gaze unwavering. To ensure your safety and return you to the capital with all haste, Amenemhat replied without hesitation. The court has been in chaos since your disappearance. Rumors of assassination, of divine displeasure. The people grow restless without your presence. Seti studied the commander's face intently, searching for any sign of deception. Nefret held her breath. After a long moment, something in the pharaoh's posture relaxed slightly. Your loyalty appears genuine, Commander Amenemhat, he declared, but I must know who else remains true among my court. If I may speak freely, Divine One, Amenemhat ventured cautiously. Seti nodded his permission. There are factions forming in your absence. High Priest Nachtmin leads those who insist on waiting for your return. Vizier Rashidi advocates for naming a regent until, he paused, clearly uncomfortable, until confirmation of your fate could be established. How convenient for the vizier, Seti remarked coldly. A shrewd light dawned in Amenemhat's eyes. You suspect treachery, my pharaoh? I do not suspect. I know. Seti's voice was like granite. I was poisoned during the ritual of renewal. The taste was masked by wine, but I recognized it, the bitter kiss of death that has claimed other kings before me. Gasps arose from the gathered soldiers. Such a crime was beyond sacrilege. It was an attack on Egypt itself. By the gods, Amenemhat breathed. Then your disappearance was my only chance at survival, Seti finished. The poison was already working through me when I fled. I took a horse and rode until consciousness failed me. He turned slightly, his expression softening as he regarded Nefret. Had this woman not found me in the desert storm, Egypt would indeed need a new pharaoh. All eyes turned to Nefret, who stood awkwardly under the sudden scrutiny of the royal guard. Amenemhat's gaze traveled over her simple linen dress, her work-worn hands, her weather-beaten face, as if trying to reconcile this ordinary village woman with the savior of their divine ruler. You have the gratitude of all Egypt, the commander said to her formally, inclining his head in a show of respect that clearly cost his pride. Nefret, uncomfortable with the attention, simply nodded. I did only what any decent person would do. No, Seti corrected gently. You did what few would have dared, taking in a stranger, tending wounds, sharing your home and food, all without question or expectation of reward. Such kindness is rare, even in the great palaces of the capital. An elderly villager stepped forward tentatively, his body bent with age but his eyes sharp with the wisdom of years. He prostrated himself before speaking. Great One, if I may, we have known Nefret since she was a child. Her heart has always been as open as the sky. When her parents were taken by fever years ago, she continued their healing work, asking payment only from those who could afford it. Many of us owe our lives to her knowledge of herbs and healing ways. Seti nodded thoughtfully. Rise, Elder. Your words confirm what I have witnessed myself. He turned back to Commander Amenemhat. But now we must act. How many men do you command? 40 spearmen and 20 archers, Divine One, all personally loyal to the throne. Good. We will need them. Seti's expression became calculating, the face of a strategist. I cannot simply return to the palace and resume my rule as if nothing happened. The vipers who tried to kill me once will strike again if given the opportunity. What are your orders, my pharaoh? Amenemhat asked, straightening with renewed purpose. Seti began to pace, his royal authority fully reasserted despite his surroundings. Send your fastest rider ahead to High Priest Nachtmin. Tell him to gather those counselors and nobles he trusts implicitly in the Temple of Amun. Not the palace, the temple. Sacred ground may make traitors hesitate. And the message, Divine One, simply this. The living Horus returns when Ra touches the western horizon tomorrow. Prepare the throne room for judgment. Seti's eyes flashed with righteous fury. Those who sought to usurp the divine order will face the consequences of their betrayal. As Amenemhat selected a messenger and conveyed these instructions, excited murmurs spread through the gathered villagers. To witness such momentous events, to have their humble settlement become part of royal history, it was beyond anything they could have imagined. Nefret, however, felt a growing unease. The man she had come to know over these past days, thoughtful, sometimes vulnerable, genuinely grateful for simple kindnesses, was transforming before her eyes into something both more and less than human. The divine pharaoh, separated from ordinary mortals by an unbridgeable gulf of status and power. As if sensing her thoughts, Seti turned back to her. "Nefret of Heka," he addressed her formally, "you must accompany us to the capital." She blinked in surprise. "Me, Divine One? I would only be in the way. My place is here with my people who need healing. Your testimony will be required," he explained, his tone softening slightly, "as witness to my condition, as the one who preserved my life. Besides," he added, his voice dropping so that only she could hear, "I would have at least one person at court whose loyalty is beyond question." Before Nefret could respond, the village headman pushed his way through the crowd, falling prostrate before the pharaoh. "Great One, this is an unprecedented honor for our humble village. We must prepare a proper feast to celebrate your divine presence among us." Seti raised a hand. "Your devotion is noted, headman, but time is against us. We depart at first light." He glanced at the stars, calculating. "The news of my survival must reach the capital under carefully controlled circumstances. The element of surprise may be our greatest weapon against the conspirators." Commander Amenemhat approached again, having dispatched the messenger. "Divine One, I've ordered my men to establish a perimeter around the village. No one enters or leaves until we depart. If there are traitors among the royal guards elsewhere, they will not learn of your recovery before you wish it known." "Well done," Seti approved. He turned back to the village headman. "We require quarters for the night, food for my guards, and fresh garments befitting my station. I cannot return to my capital in blood-stained rags." The headman nearly tripped over himself in his eagerness to comply. "My own house is at your disposal, Great One. It is the largest in the village. My wives are already preparing the finest chambers. See that healer Nefret is given suitable quarters as well," Seti commanded. "She travels with us to the capital as my honored guest." This pronouncement sent fresh ripples of excitement through the villagers, one of their own to be taken to the royal court. Such a thing had never happened in living memory. As preparations were made to relocate the pharaoh to the headman's house, Nefret found herself suddenly surrounded by women from the village, all offering advice, clothing, trinkets, anything they thought might help her appear more suitable for royal company. "You must take my lapis beads," insisted one woman, pressing a simple necklace into Nefret's hands. "They belong to my grandmother, who came from the capital. They say the royal ladies all wear lapis." "And my coal pot," added another. "Your eyes must be properly lined if you're to stand before the court." Overwhelmed, Nefret tried to refuse these precious offerings, but the village women were insistent. This was their chance to be part of something momentous, to have a representative of their remote community stand in the presence of Egypt's elite. Later, as the village finally quieted under the watchful eyes of the royal guards, Nefret sat alone in the small chamber that had been hastily prepared for her in the headman's house. Through the thin mud brick wall, she could hear the low murmur of voices as Seti conferred with Commander Amenemhat, plotting their return to the capital and the confrontation that would surely follow. The weight of what was happening finally settled on her. In a matter of days, her quiet life had been completely upended. Tomorrow she would leave the only home she had ever known, traveling to the great capital she had only heard about in travelers' tales. And for what? To stand witness against powerful conspirators who had already tried to murder the pharaoh once? Fear coiled in her stomach like a desert viper. What place could someone like her, a simple village healer with dirt beneath her fingernails and calluses on her palms, possibly have in the glittering, dangerous world of the royal court? A soft knock at her door interrupted these troubling thoughts. Expecting one of the village women with yet another well-intentioned gift, Nefret was startled to find Pharaoh Seti himself standing in her doorway, flanked by two stone-faced guards who stared fixedly ahead. "Divine One," she gasped, immediately bowing her head. "Leave us," Seti commanded the guards, who hesitated only briefly before retreating to positions at the end of the corridor. When they were alone, Seti closed the door part way, a compromise between propriety and privacy. "You are troubled," he stated, not a question but an observation. Nefret struggled to find appropriate words. How did one admit fear to a living god? I am merely overwhelmed, Great One. I've never left this village. The capital is not my world." A hint of the man she had nursed back to health emerged as Seti's expression softened slightly. "Nor was it mine once." Confusion must have shown on her face, for he continued, "Before I was pharaoh, I was a second son, never expected to rule. I spent my youth in the northern marshes, hunting and fishing with common men, living in reed huts, far from court intrigue." A shadow passed over his features, "until my brother's unexpected death placed the double crown on my head instead." "I didn't know," Nefret said softly, fascinated by this glimpse into the human history behind the divine facade. "Few do. The court prefers stories of divine perfection, not awkward second sons who had to learn statecraft in a hurry." For just a moment, Seti seemed almost wistful. "Sometimes I miss the simplicity of those days, the honesty of labor, of friendship, not tainted by ambition." He shook his head slightly, as if clearing away unwelcome memories. "What I mean to say is this. You need not fear the capital or its people. They are just men and women like those in your village, only with finer clothes and more practiced lies." His mouth quirked in a brief, ironic smile. "And unlike them, you have the pharaoh's protection." Before Nefret could respond, Seti straightened, royal dignity settling back over him like a mantle. "Rest well. Dawn comes early, and the road to the capital is long." With that, he was gone, leaving Nefret with her fears somewhat calmed but her thoughts in greater turmoil than before. The glimpse of the man beneath the royal exterior only deepened her confusion about her own complicated feelings. Outside, the village dogs began to bark, alerting the guards to movement on the outskirts of the settlement. Nefret moved to her small window, peering out into the darkness. In the distance, torchlight approached, another group of soldiers riding hard toward the village. Her heart began to pound again. Friends or foes, more loyal guards or agents of the conspiracy, come to finish what the poison had failed to accomplish. As the new arrivals were challenged at the perimeter, Nefret watched anxiously, knowing that with each passing hour, the stakes grew higher. By this time tomorrow, she would either be standing in the greatest city in the world, witnessing the pharaoh's triumph over his enemies, or she would be dead alongside him, a footnote in a failed chapter of Egypt's long history. Either way, there was no turning back to the simple life she had known just days ago. Like it or not, her destiny was now bound to that of Pharaoh Seti, the living god she had found dying in the desert sand. The journey to the capital took 3 exhausting days. By royal decree, Nefret rode in a covered litter alongside Pharaoh Seti's own palanquin, an honor that left her equal parts grateful for avoiding the punishing desert sun and mortified by the attention. The royal procession moved with surprising speed, stopping only when absolutely necessary, pushing both humans and horses to their limits. Each night, as they made camp beneath the vast expanse of stars, Nefret watched Seti transform further into the ruler he was born to be. More memories returned with each passing hour, names of officials, details of ceremonies, faces of those he had trusted. Some recollections brought satisfaction, others kindled a cold fury in his eyes that made even veteran soldiers step back. On the evening of the 3rd day, the great walls of the capital finally appeared on the horizon, their white limestone gleaming gold in the setting sun. The sight stole Nefret's breath away. Nothing in her village life had prepared her for the sheer scale of the city, sprawling, teeming with life, dominated by towering temples and palaces that seemed to touch the heavens themselves. "Magnificent, isn't it?" Commander Amenemhat remarked, noticing her awestruck expression as she peered from her litter. "The greatest city in the world." "It's overwhelming," Nefret admitted. In truth, the word barely captured the mix of wonder and terror churning inside her. Here, among these grand buildings and sophisticated people, her provincial origins would be painfully obvious. As the procession approached the massive city gates, Seti ordered a halt. He summoned Amenemhat and his most trusted lieutenants, along with Nefret, to his temporary command tent erected just beyond view of the city walls. "The moment we enter the capital, we lose the advantage of surprise," the pharaoh stated, his voice crisp with authority. "Spies watch the gates. Word of my return will reach the palace before we do." A large papyrus map of the city lay spread across a wooden table. Seti's finger traced a path not toward the gleaming royal palace, visible even from this distance, but toward a massive temple complex. "We go directly to the Temple of Amun," he declared. "Nachtmin will have gathered those loyal to the crown as I instructed. From sacred ground, we will spring our trap." Amenemhat nodded in approval. "And Vizier Rashidi. He will certainly hear of your arrival." A dangerous smile played across Seti's lips. "Let him come. Let him bring his conspirators. The temple grounds will be where this viper finally shows his fangs." The commander's expression remained troubled. "Divine One, with respect, we number only 60 men. If Rashidi controls the palace guard—" "He doesn't," Seti interrupted with certainty. "Captain Horemheb commands the palace guard, and he was my father's most loyal servant before becoming mine. If Rashidi has turned him, then Egypt is already lost." He straightened, resolution hardening his features. "But I do not believe that is the case." As the men continued discussing strategy, Nefret listened quietly, trying to absorb the political complexities she'd never had reason to understand before. Names and titles swirled in her head: High Priest Nachtmin, Vizier Rashidi, Captain Horemheb, the Royal Treasurer Senefer, a web of alliances and rivalries she could barely fathom. "And what of the healer?" one of the lieutenants asked suddenly, gesturing toward Nefret. "She cannot enter the temple's inner sanctum. Only priests and royalty may cross that threshold." All eyes turned to her, and Nefret felt herself shrinking under their scrutiny. For a moment, she allowed herself to hope this might be her chance to fade away, to return to the simple life she knew. Perhaps they would realize she had no place in this dangerous game of power and betrayal. But Seti was already shaking his head. "Nefret's testimony is crucial. She alone witnessed my condition after the poisoning. She alone treated wounds that would have killed a lesser man." His gaze met hers, unwavering in its intensity. "Without her, I cannot prove the attempt on my life." "Then she must wait in the outer courtyard," the lieutenant conceded, "until she is called to speak." Seti considered this, then turned to Nefret. "Would you be comfortable with such an arrangement?" The question startled her. Since when did pharaohs ask the preferences of village healers? Yet the genuine concern in his voice reminded her of the vulnerable man she had nursed back to health, a side of him these soldiers had likely never witnessed. "I will do whatever is needed, Divine One," she answered carefully, "though I fear my words will carry little weight against those of a royal vizier." "Truth has its own weight," Seti replied with quiet conviction. "And sometimes the gods speak most clearly through the simplest voices." He turned back to his commanders. "We enter the city at dusk, when the changing of the gate guards will cause confusion. Move swiftly and directly to the temple. Let no one delay us." As the men dispersed to prepare their soldiers, Seti gestured for Nefret to remain. When they were alone, she noticed him sway slightly, one hand moving to his temple in a gesture of pain she had come to recognize during his recovery. "You still suffer after effects of the poison," she said, healer's instincts overriding royal protocol. "It comes and goes," he admitted, dropping the facade of invulnerability he maintained before his men. "Moments of weakness, flashes of pain, reminders that I am still mortal beneath the crown." Nefret reached for her small pouch of remedies that never left her side. "I have herbs that might help." "No," Seti stopped her with a gentle but firm gesture. "I must have a clear mind tonight, no matter the cost. What happens in the coming hours will determine the future of Egypt." His expression softened marginally. "But I thank you for your concern." He straightened his shoulders, visibly assembling his royal persona once more. "There is something else you should know, Nefret of Heka, something I remembered only last night." Her heart quickened at his tone. "Divine One? The poison used against me. It was rare, exotic. Few would know of it. Fewer still could obtain it." His eyes grew distant with the memory. "It causes a slow death that mimics natural illness. Had I drunk the full cup, I would have appeared to sicken and die over several days, with symptoms no physician would question in a man of my age." "Clever," Nefret murmured. "No suspicion of foul play would arise." "Precisely. But such poison comes from far-off lands beyond our borders." Seti's expression darkened. "Only one person in my court had recently returned from a diplomatic mission to those regions." Nefret's breath caught. "Vizier Rashidi. Indeed. And now I remember the cup, his insistence that I drink deeply for the blessing to take hold." Seti's hand curled into a fist. "I trusted him as a brother. He served my father before me with seeming loyalty. How long, I wonder, had he planned my death?" The raw hurt beneath the anger in Seti's voice touched something in Nefret. For all his divine status, in that moment, he was simply a man betrayed by someone he had trusted implicitly. "Power changes people," she offered softly, thinking of the petty rivalries she'd witnessed even in her small village when someone gained a position of minor authority. "It can twist even the noblest heart, or reveal the truth of a heart that was always corrupt," Seti countered. He shook his head. "But philosophizing must wait. Tonight, justice takes precedence." As dusk approached, the royal procession reorganized itself. Seti exchanged his travel-worn garments for the full regalia of pharaonic power: gleaming gold collar, ceremonial kilt with the royal apron, and the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. The transformation was so complete that even Nefret, who had tended to him at his most vulnerable, felt the instinctive urge to prostrate herself before this living embodiment of divine authority. For her part, Nefret had been given clothing that marked her as a person of importance, far finer than anything she had worn before, yet modest enough not to overstep the boundaries of her station. The village women's gifts, the lapis beads, the kohl for her eyes, completed her transformation from simple healer to what exactly? She wasn't sure. Not quite servant, not quite companion. Something unprecedented, undefined. As promised, they entered the city at dusk, when the great gates were at their busiest with merchants leaving and residents returning. Even so, the sight of royal standards caused an immediate stir. Within moments, people were dropping to their knees in the streets, foreheads pressed to the ground as the pharaoh's procession passed. "The living Horus returns!" The cry began somewhere near the gates and spread through the city like wildfire, echoing off stone walls and carrying across rooftops. "Pharaoh Seti lives!" From her curtained litter, Nefret watched the capital's residents react with wild displays of emotion, weeping, praying, casting flowers in the path of the royal guard. The depth of their devotion to a ruler many had never seen up close struck her profoundly. These were not the calculated gestures of courtiers seeking favor, but the genuine relief of a people who believed their divine protector had been restored to them. Commander Amenemhat rode close to Seti's palanquin, his sharp eyes constantly scanning the growing crowds. "News travels faster than we anticipated, Divine One," he reported. "The vizier will know by now." "Good," came Seti's calm reply. "Let him stew in fear while we secure holy ground." As they approached the massive temple of Amun, Nefret gasped at its sheer scale. The great pylons towered above them, carved with images of gods and pharaohs, painted in vivid colors that glowed in the dying light. Rows of sphinx statues lined the approach, their enigmatic smiles seeming to hold secrets untold for centuries. At the temple steps, a group of priests waited, led by an imposing figure in a leopard skin cloak, High Priest Nachtmin, just as Seti had described him in his returning memories. The old man's eyes glistened with tears as he prostrated himself before the pharaoh. "The god returns to us," he declared, his voice breaking with emotion. "Amun be praised." Seti descended from his palanquin, every movement measured and regal. "Rise, faithful servant. Have you done as I commanded?" "Yes, Divine One," Nachtmin confirmed as he got to his feet. "Those you named are gathered in the Hall of Columns, awaiting your divine presence. The sacred precinct has been cleared of all others." "And the vizier?" "Sent word that he comes with all haste from the palace." The high priest's expression turned grave. "He brings a substantial escort." Seti's face revealed nothing, but Nefret, who had come to read his subtle expressions, recognized the slight tightening around his eyes that indicated heightened alertness. "Then we shall prepare to receive him properly," the pharaoh said. He turned to Commander Amenemhat. "Position your archers on the temple roof. The rest of your men will form a perimeter around the sacred precinct. No one enters behind me without my express permission." As the soldiers moved to their positions, Seti approached Nefret's litter. The bearers immediately set it down and backed away, heads bowed. "We have reached the moment of truth," he told her quietly as she emerged. "Are you ready?" Nefret glanced up at the looming temple, then at the crowd still gathering in the plaza beyond. Nothing in her life had prepared her for this moment, yet here she stood, about to participate in events that would be recorded in the annals of Egypt's history. "I am ready, Divine One," she answered, summoning courage she wasn't sure she possessed. Seti studied her face, then did something that sent shockwaves through those close enough to witness it. He reached out and briefly touched her shoulder, a gesture of reassurance that a pharaoh simply did not bestow upon commoners. "Remember," he said for her ears alone, "you saved the son of Amun when he was nothing more than a nameless man in the desert. That courage will serve you well now." With that, he turned and began ascending the temple steps, his royal regalia catching the last rays of the setting sun. High Priest Nakmin led the way, followed by a procession of lesser priests swinging censers of fragrant incense. Nefret, as arranged, was escorted to a small antechamber in the outer courtyard, where she could wait until called upon to testify. The waiting was excruciating. Through the stone walls, she could hear only muffled sounds, the rhythmic chanting of priests, the occasional raised voice, the coming and going of messengers. An hour passed, then another. The temple lamps were lit as darkness fell completely, casting long shadows across the painted reliefs that decorated every surface. Finally, a temple guard appeared at her door. "The Divine One summons you," he announced formally. "You will follow me to the Hall of Columns." Heart-pounding, Nefret rose and followed him through a labyrinth of corridors. The smell of incense grew stronger, mingling with the scent of oil lamps and the indefinable ancient odor of stone that had stood for centuries. They passed through smaller chambers, each more richly decorated than the last, until they reached an immense doorway flanked by statues of Amun-Ra. "Speak only when addressed directly by the Divine One," the guard instructed her. "Keep your eyes lowered unless commanded to raise them, and do not under any circumstances approach the throne uninvited." Nefret nodded her understanding, then steeled herself as the massive cedar doors swung open before her. The Hall of Columns took her breath away. Enormous painted pillars soared upward, carved to resemble bundled papyrus stalks, supporting a ceiling so high it was lost in shadow despite the hundreds of lamps illuminating the space. Between the columns stood statues of gods and former pharaohs, their painted eyes seeming to follow her as she was led down the central aisle. At the far end of the hall, Seti sat upon a portable throne placed on a raised dais. The double crown of Egypt rested upon his head, and he held the crook and flail, symbols of his divine authority, crossed over his chest. His expression was impassive, revealing nothing of the man Nefret had come to know during his recovery. To his right stood High Priest Nakmin. To his left, a military officer she didn't recognize, but guessed might be Captain Horemheb of the Palace Guard. Arrayed before the throne in a semicircle were perhaps 24 men, nobles, priests, and officials, judging by their elaborate garments and insignia of office. And directly before the pharaoh, on his knees with his forehead pressed to the stone floor, was a man whose rich robes and abundance of gold jewelry marked him as perhaps the highest-ranking person present besides Seti himself, Vizier Rashidi. It could be no other. As Nefret approached, she caught the tail end of what appeared to be an impassioned declaration of loyalty from the prostrate vizier. "Swear by all the gods, Divine One, that I have sought nothing but your safe return since the moment your disappearance was discovered," Rashidi was saying, his voice resonant and practiced. "Those who claim otherwise speak from jealousy or ignorance of my devotion to your divine person." Seti's expression remained unreadable. "Rise, Vizier. Your protestations of loyalty have been noted." As Rashidi got to his feet, Nefret had her first clear view of the man. He was older than she had expected, perhaps 50, with a face that managed to be simultaneously handsome and unsettling. His smile did not reach his calculating eyes, which darted briefly to Nefret as she was brought forward, then dismissed her as insignificant. "Ah, this must be the village woman I've heard mentioned," Rashidi said smoothly. "How fortunate that she happened upon you in your hour of need, Divine One." Something in his tone suggested the opposite of his words, that he found the timing not fortunate, but suspicious. Seti gestured for Nefret to approach. "Healer Nefret of Heka, come forward." She did as commanded, keeping her eyes modestly lowered, as the guard had instructed, though she could feel the weight of dozens of stares upon her. "Look at me," Seti ordered, and she raised her eyes to meet his. In the depths of his dark gaze, she caught a flicker of the man she had nursed, a silent reassurance amid the theater of power playing out around them. "Tell those assembled exactly how you found me, and in what condition," he instructed. Drawing a deep breath, Nefret recounted the events as clearly as she could. The sandstorm, the discovery of the injured stranger, the symptoms she had observed and treated over the following days. She described his gradual recovery of memory, culminating in the realization of his true identity. As she spoke, she became aware of subtle shifts in the atmosphere of the great hall. Whispers passed between nobles. The vizier's expression darkened. High Priest Nakmin nodded slowly, as if her account confirmed his suspicions. When she finished, Seti turned his attention back to Rashidi. The healer describes symptoms consistent with poisoning, not injury from an assailant as you suggested in your account, Vizier. Rashidi's face registered shock, quickly replaced by concern. Divine One, with the greatest respect, this woman is a provincial herb gatherer with no training in the royal medical arts. Perhaps what she witnessed was simply the after effects of your ordeal, not poison at all. Perhaps, Seti conceded. Yet I find it curious that I distinctly remember a bitter taste in the ceremonial wine you personally handed me during the renewal ritual, a taste I did not detect in previous ceremonies. The Vizier paled slightly, but maintained his composure. The ritual wine is prepared by the temple brewers, Divine One. I merely had the honor of presenting it. If there was an unusual flavor, perhaps it was a new spice added by the priests. High Priest Nachtman stepped forward, indignation evident in his bearing. No changes were made to the sacred recipe, which has remained unaltered for 500 years. Then perhaps the Divine One's palate was affected by fatigue or the incense-heavy air, Rashidi suggested, his voice still smooth, though perspiration had appeared on his brow. Seti leaned forward slightly. Or perhaps, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous softness, the wine was tainted by someone who wished to see a new pharaoh upon the throne of Egypt. The accusation hung in the air, like the blade of an executioner's axe. No one dared speak or move. Rashidi's face underwent a remarkable transformation, from feigned confusion to calculated assessment, to finally a cold mask of defiance. You have no proof of such a monstrous claim, he said, abandoning the pretense of humility. Only the ramblings of a man who, by his own admission, lost his memory, and the testimony of an ignorant village woman who would say anything her pharaoh commanded. Nefret felt a jolt of anger at being so dismissed, but she held her tongue. This was not her battle to fight. I need no further proof than what I witnessed firsthand, Seti replied. But if confirmation is required, he made a gesture and a side door opened. A young man entered, trembling visibly as he approached the throne and prostrated himself. Nefret recognized the embroidered apron of a royal cupbearer. Rise and tell these assembled nobles what you witnessed on the night of the renewal ritual, Seti commanded. The cupbearer got shakily to his feet, his eyes darting fearfully toward Vizier Rashidi. Divine One, I saw the Vizier add something to your ceremonial cup before presenting it, a powder from a small vial he kept in his sleeve. Gasps and murmurs erupted throughout the hall. Rashidi's face contorted with fury. This is absurd. The boy lies. He was nowhere near. Silence! Seti's voice cracked like thunder in the vast chamber. The cupbearer's testimony confirms what I already knew in my heart. You, Rashidi, whom I trusted above all others, betrayed not just your pharaoh, but Egypt itself. The Vizier's demeanor changed again, calculation replacing indignation. His eyes flicked toward the entrance to the hall where his personal guards waited. Nefret wondered if he was contemplating escape, or something worse. Even if what you claim were true, Rashidi said carefully, what would you do about it now, Pharaoh Seti? Half the court believes you dead already. The treasury officials answer to me. The grain storage is under my seal. The provincial governors look to me for direction. A cold smile spread across his face. Would you risk civil war to punish one man? Not one man, Seti countered. A conspiracy. Names, Rashidi. Give me the names of your co-conspirators, and perhaps your family will be spared the consequences of your treason. For a moment, something like fear flickered in the Vizier's eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by a fatalistic resolve. There are no others, he claimed. If I indeed committed such a crime, which I continue to deny, I acted alone. Seti studied him intently. You lie to protect them even now. Such loyalty might be admirable, if not offered in service to such treachery. He raised his voice, addressing the entire assembly. Let it be known that from this moment, Rashidi no longer holds the office of Vizier. His properties are forfeit to the crown. His name will be struck from all monuments, and his body, upon his death, will be denied proper burial rites. The assembled nobles reacted with varying degrees of shock, some clearly horrified by the severity of the punishment, others nodding in somber agreement. Rashidi himself seemed to shrink before their eyes, the full weight of his disgrace crushing his former arrogance. To be denied proper burial was a fate worse than death itself. His soul would wander eternally, finding no peace in the afterlife. You may choose exile or execution, Seti continued, his voice implacable, but choose now. Before the disgraced Vizier could respond, a commotion erupted at the hall's entrance. Guards shouted warnings, weapons clashed, and suddenly the doors burst open to admit a contingent of soldiers, not wearing the insignia of the royal guard, but bearing the personal standard of Vizier Rashidi. "Seize the impostor on the throne," shouted their leader. "The true pharaoh approaches." Chaos erupted in the Hall of Columns. Nobles scrambled for safety as Seti's guards moved to protect their ruler. Nefret found herself roughly shoved aside by fleeing courtiers, losing her balance and falling against one of the massive pillars. From this position, she had a clear view of what happened next. Vizier Rashidi, seizing the moment of confusion, pulled a curved dagger from within his robes and lunged toward the throne. Captain Horemheb intercepted him, but not before the blade sliced across his arm, drawing blood. As the two men grappled, more soldiers poured into the hall, these wearing the distinctive uniform of the palace guard. For a terrifying moment, Nefret couldn't tell which side they were joining. Then their commander's voice rang out, "Protect the Divine One! Subdue the traitors!" The fighting was brutal but brief. Outnumbered and surrounded, Rashidi's personal guard soon surrendered. The vizier himself was disarmed and forced to his knees before Seti, who had not moved from his throne throughout the chaos, his expression one of cold fury. "It seems you've answered my question, Rashidi," the pharaoh said, his voice cutting through the diminishing sounds of struggle. "You've chosen execution." The former vizier glared up at him, all pretense abandoned. "You were never meant to rule, second son. Your brother was groomed from birth for the throne. His death was unfortunate timing." Seti's eyes narrowed. "What are you saying?" A horrible laugh escaped Rashidi. "Why stop with one confession when I'm already condemned? Yes, I poisoned you, but it wasn't my first time." He lowered his voice so only those closest could hear. "Your brother's hunting accident? Not so accidental." Nefret saw Seti go rigid, his knuckles whitening around the royal crook and flail. For a moment, she feared he might strike Rashidi dead on the spot. Instead, he mastered himself with visible effort. "Captain Horemheb," he called, his voice steady despite the revelation. "Take this creature to the deepest dungeon. Tomorrow at dawn, he dies the traitor's death before all of Memphis." As Rashidi was dragged away, still laughing that terrible laugh, Seti finally allowed himself to look visibly shaken. His gaze found Nefret, still pressed against the column, and something passed between them, a shared witness to the depths of human depravity, a mutual understanding that some wounds would never fully heal. In that moment, as nobles and priests cautiously returned to restore order to the sacred hall, Nefret realized that her role in this royal drama was far from over. Whatever came next, she was now irreversibly entangled in the fate of Pharaoh Seti, a man who had entered her life as a nameless stranger and now sat on the most powerful throne in the known world. And despite all logic and propriety, despite the yawning chasm of status between them, she found herself caring deeply what became of him, not as the divine ruler of Egypt, but as the man whose wounds she had tended, whose nightmares she had soothed, whose vulnerability she alone had witnessed. It was a dangerous feeling, one that could lead nowhere good. But as Seti rose from his throne to address his court, his eyes briefly meeting hers across the chaotic hall, Nefret knew it was already too late to turn back. Dawn broke over the capital, painting the limestone buildings in hues of gold and rose. The news of Pharaoh Seti's return had spread like wildfire through the city, drawing thousands to the palace square where royal heralds confirmed what many still could scarcely believe: their divine ruler lived. For Nefret, the morning brought new anxieties. After the dramatic confrontation in the Temple of Amun, she had been given luxurious quarters within the palace itself, a dizzying change from her humble village home. Servants attended her every need, treating her with a deference that made her profoundly uncomfortable. "The Divine One requests your presence in the throne room," announced a royal steward, bowing low before her. "Noble garments have been provided." The noble garments proved to be a finely pleated linen dress, adorned with delicate beadwork and a wide collar of turquoise and gold, clothing fit for a high-ranking court lady, not a village healer. Nefret donned them awkwardly, feeling like an imposter. When she entered the vast throne room, she found it packed with nobles, officials, and foreign dignitaries, all craning to catch a glimpse of the pharaoh who had returned from the brink of death. Seti sat upon the great throne of Egypt, resplendent in full ceremonial regalia. If he still suffered effects from the poison, his regal bearing revealed nothing of it. "Approach, healer Nefret of Heka," he commanded, his voice carrying effortlessly across the hushed chamber. Heart pounding, Nefret walked the seemingly endless distance to the foot of the throne, aware of hundreds of curious eyes upon her. She knelt as she had been instructed, head bowed. "Rise and face your pharaoh," Seti ordered. When she did, she was startled to see warmth in his eyes despite his formal tone. "Egypt owes you a debt that cannot be measured. When I lay dying in the desert, you alone showed mercy. When I was without memory or name, you gave me shelter. Today, before all the court, I honor your courage and compassion." He gestured, and a servant stepped forward bearing a golden collar on a cushion, the highest honor that could be bestowed upon a commoner. "From this day forward, you shall be known as Nefret, beloved of Pharaoh, granted royal protection, and the status of honored healer to the court." Gasps and murmurs swept through the assembly. Such elevation was unprecedented, particularly for a provincial woman with no noble blood or connections. As the heavy gold collar was placed around her neck, Nefret felt dizzy with the unreality of it all. This wasn't the recognition she had sought or expected. It bound her to the court and to Seti in ways she hadn't anticipated. "Thank you, Divine One," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "I did only what any person of conscience would do." A slight smile touched Seti's lips. "And that, Nefret of Heka, is precisely why you deserve this honor." But as she backed away from the throne, Nefret caught flashes of hostile glances from the court nobles. Their expressions made one thing abundantly clear. Her elevation had made her powerful new enemies. What should have been a moment of triumph instead filled her with foreboding. She had saved the pharaoh, helped restore him to his throne, and exposed a deadly conspiracy. Yet somehow she sensed that her greatest challenges still lay ahead. The execution of Vizier Rashidi at dawn had drawn massive crowds, their cries for justice echoing off the palace walls as the traitor met his fate. But while the people celebrated in the streets, tensions simmered within the royal court. Seti had ordered an emergency council meeting, gathering his remaining advisors in the private audience chamber, away from curious eyes and listening ears. Nefret stood quietly in a corner, still unused to her new position. She wasn't entirely sure why Seti had insisted on her presence, but she didn't dare question a pharaoh's command. "The conspiracy runs deeper than Rashidi alone," Seti declared, pacing before his assembled officials. His final confession implicated others, including my brother's so-called hunting accident. "I want every member of his household questioned, every document examined, every connection investigated." High Priest Nachtmin nodded gravely. "Already done, Divine One. Several of his household scribes are providing names in exchange for mercy." Captain Horemheb, his injured arm now bandaged, stepped forward. "3 provincial governors have been implicated, my pharaoh. They were promised wealth and expanded territories in exchange for supporting Rashidi after your removal." Seti's expression hardened. "Dispatch troops immediately. I want them brought to the capital in chains." A thin, nervous-looking man, whom Nefret recognized as the royal treasurer, cleared his throat. "Divine One, there is also the matter of the missing gold. Nearly a tenth of the royal treasury has been diverted over the past year. We believed it authorized by you, but in light of recent events, funds to finance rebellion." Seti concluded grimly. "Trace every coin, Senefer. I want to know exactly who benefited from this theft." As the meeting continued, Nefret observed the interplay of power and suspicion among the officials. Some seemed genuinely horrified by the conspiracy, while others appeared more concerned with ensuring they themselves weren't implicated. Names were mentioned, accusations made, defenses offered. Suddenly, Seti turned to her. "Healer Nefret, you had no stake in court politics before this. Your eyes are unclouded by years of alliances and rivalries. What do you observe in this room?" The chamber fell silent. Every face turned toward her, expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. Nefret felt her mouth go dry. I am just a village healer, Divine One. Court intrigue is beyond my understanding." "Precisely why your perspective holds value," Seti insisted. "Speak freely, you have my protection." Gathering her courage, Nefret looked around the chamber, recalling the conversations she had just witnessed. "It seems to me that everyone is very quick to condemn Vizier Rashidi now that he is dead and cannot defend himself. Perhaps some who point fingers most vigorously do so to divert attention from their own involvement." A chorus of outraged protests erupted, but Seti silenced them with a raised hand, his eyes never leaving Nefret's face. "Continue," he commanded. "In my village," she said carefully, "when poison affects one person, we examine what everyone ate. When it affects many, we look to the water source. She paused, then added, "Perhaps you should consider what connects all those involved in the conspiracy, beyond their loyalty to Rashidi." A slow smile spread across Seti's face. "Wisdom indeed from the village healer. Thank you, Nefret." He turned back to his stunned council. "You have your orders. This meeting is concluded, except for you, High Priest. Remain." As the officials filed out, many casting resentful glances at Nefret, she realized she had just made herself a target. But the approving nod from Seti told her she had chosen correctly. The water source of this conspiracy had yet to be found. A week passed in a whirlwind of activity as Seti ruthlessly purged the conspiracy from his court. Provincial governors were replaced, treasury officials questioned, palace servants scrutinized. The atmosphere in the royal residence remained tense, with everyone watching for signs of where the pharaoh's suspicion might fall next. For Nefret, the days had been a strange mixture of luxury and isolation. Her new quarters were sumptuous beyond imagination, yet she felt utterly alone among the courtiers, who regarded her with barely concealed disdain. Many whispered that she had somehow enchanted the pharaoh, using village magic to secure her unprecedented position. She was contemplating these rumors while sitting in the palace gardens when a royal herald approached. "The Divine One summons you to the Great Hall of Audiences immediately," he announced with a formal bow that didn't quite mask his personal disapproval. When Nefret arrived, she found the hall filled with nobles, foreign ambassadors, and high officials. A formal court gathering of the kind she'd heard about but never witnessed. Seti sat upon the golden throne, his expression inscrutable as she was led to stand before him. "Healer Nefret," he began, his voice pitched to carry throughout the vast chamber. "For 7 days my investigators have followed the trail of conspiracy that nearly destroyed Egypt. For 7 days the guilty have faced justice. Today, that work is complete." Murmurs spread through the assembly. Nefret wondered why she had been summoned for this announcement. "Throughout this ordeal," Seti continued, "one truth has become clear. The person who showed the greatest loyalty to the throne was the one with no obligation to do so. A commoner who risked everything to save a stranger, not knowing he was her pharaoh." All eyes turned to Nefret, making her wish she could disappear into the polished floor beneath her feet. "Such loyalty deserves more than mere gold or titles," Seti declared. "It deserves a sacred oath in return." To the shock of everyone present, Nefret most of all, Seti rose from his throne and descended the steps until he stood directly before her. A collective gasp echoed through the hall. Pharaohs did not leave their thrones to approach subjects. Subjects approached them. "I, Seti, son of Amun, lord of the two lands, make this oath before all assembled," he proclaimed. "For as long as I draw breath, Nefret of Heka shall enjoy my personal protection and favor. Any harm done to her shall be answered as if done to my own royal person. Any word spoken against her shall be considered an insult to the throne itself." Nefret stared in disbelief. Such an oath was unprecedented, a divine protection that elevated her nearly to the status of royal family. "Furthermore," Seti continued, appearing to enjoy the stunned silence of his court, "she shall serve as royal healer, with authority to inspect all food and drink prepared for the pharaoh's table. Her knowledge of poisons and remedies shall be Egypt's shield against future treachery." With these words, Seti transformed what many had seen as an embarrassing royal infatuation into a practical appointment that none could openly challenge. It was masterfully done, though Nefret sensed motives beyond the practical in his extraordinary gesture. As the court reluctantly acknowledged the proclamation with bowed heads, Seti spoke softly, for her ears alone. "Now they cannot touch you without facing my wrath. But be vigilant, Nefret. Those who could not reach me may still seek to strike at what I value." His eyes held hers for a moment longer than protocol demanded, conveying a message beyond his words. In that instant, Nefret understood that while he had indeed secured her safety, he had also confirmed every rumor about her importance to him, for better or worse. The day of judgment dawned bright and merciless. In the great courtyard of the palace, the remaining conspirators knelt in chains awaiting the pharaoh's verdict. Thousands had gathered to witness justice being served, nobles and commoners alike united in their desire to see traitors punished. Nefret stood on a balcony overlooking the proceedings, her new position as royal healer granting her a place among the court elite. Beside her, ladies of noble birth kept a careful distance, their whispered comments just loud enough for her to hear. "A village witch," one murmured behind her fan. "She must have used some Eastern potion to bewitch our pharaoh." "It won't last," another replied confidently. Once he tires of his exotic pet, she'll be sent back to whatever mud hut she came from. Nefret pretended not to hear, focusing instead on the ceremony below. Seti had entered the courtyard, the sun glinting off his golden regalia as he took his place on a portable throne. High Priest Nakhtmin stood at his right hand, Captain Horemheb at his left. "Behold the enemies of Egypt," the herald proclaimed, "those who sought to poison the divine blood of Pharaoh, to plunge our blessed land into chaos, to betray the trust of gods and men alike." One by one, the conspirators' crimes were announced to the crowd. Some had contributed gold to finance the plot. Others had agreed to support Rashidi's claim to the throne once Seti was dead. A few had directly assisted in preparing the poison. The punishments varied according to the severity of involvement. Lesser participants were sentenced to exile in the mines of Sinai, a living death of endless labor under the desert sun. Higher-ranking conspirators faced execution, their bodies to be burned and their ashes scattered, denying them proper burial and afterlife. As the sentences were carried out, Nefret found herself torn between satisfaction that justice was being served and horror at the brutality of the punishments. In her village, even the worst criminals were granted the dignity of proper funeral rites. When the final conspirator had been dealt with, Seti rose to address the crowd. "Let all of Egypt learn from what has transpired here today. Treachery against the throne is treachery against Mahat herself, the divine order that sustains our world. But know also that loyalty will be rewarded as surely as betrayal is punished." His eyes scanned the crowd, then lifted to the balcony where Nefret stood. The assembled masses followed his gaze, and suddenly thousands of eyes were upon her. A wave of whispers spread through the courtyard as common people asked each other who this woman might be that commanded the pharaoh's attention so publicly. Later, as Nefret walked the palace corridors alone, she confronted the reality of her situation. The conspirators had been punished, justice had been served, but she remained caught between worlds, no longer belonging to her village, yet not accepted by the court. The pharaoh's protection was both blessing and curse, setting her apart in ways that left her profoundly isolated. "You look troubled, healer Nefret." She turned to find an older man watching her, his simple white kilt and shaved head marking him as a scribe. There was kindness in his weathered face, something she had seen precious little of since arriving at the palace. "I'm simply adjusting," she replied carefully, unsure of this stranger's intentions. "To a world where yesterday's executions are today's gossip?" He smiled sadly. "The palace has always been thus, dangerous for those who don't understand its rules." "And you do?" she asked. "I've survived 40 years as royal archivist." He bowed slightly. "Amenemhat at your service." The name startled her. "Like the commander who found us in the village." "My nephew," he explained. "A good man in a difficult position." His expression grew serious. "As are you, healer Nefret. The pharaoh's favor shines brightly upon you, which casts equally dark shadows." "I never sought this position," she said defensively. "Yet here you stand, wearing the gold of royal appointment." His eyes were kind but direct. "I offer neither judgment nor flattery, merely observation, and perhaps, if you wish it, guidance in navigating these treacherous waters." Nefret hesitated, studying him. In a court full of false smiles and hidden agendas, Amenemhat's straightforward manner was refreshing. Whether friend or foe remained to be seen, but she desperately needed an ally who understood palace politics. "I would welcome such guidance," she admitted. The old scribe nodded, satisfied. "Then let us begin with your most pressing question. Can you truly belong in the pharaoh's world?" The answer, healer Nefret, might not be what you hope to hear. Amenemhat, the royal archivist, became Nefret's mentor in navigating court politics. When Lady Iset was caught trying to poison Nefret, the court expected her to demand harsh justice. Instead, she shocked everyone by requesting mercy. "Compassion is a healer's first duty," she explained, "even toward those who wish us harm." Seti spared Lady Iset's life, sentencing her to exile instead of execution. Afterward, Amenemhat spoke before the court. "I have served 6 pharaohs," he declared. "Many royal consorts brought wealth or noble blood. None brought what this healer has, wisdom that tempers justice with mercy." His words changed how many at court viewed Nefret. For the first time, she felt she might find her place in this world of intrigue, not by becoming like the nobles who scorned her, but by remaining true to her principles. 3 months after rescuing Seti, Nefret learned troubling news from Amenemhat. The council was pressing the pharaoh to choose a royal bride from 3 foreign princesses. Palace life will become untenable for you once Seti takes a wife, the old scribe warned. Return to your village with dignity. Nefret decided to leave before witnessing Seti marry another, but when she prepared to request an audience, the pharaoh summoned her first. Are you planning to leave? He asked directly. Yes, she admitted. Before your future queen makes my position here impossible. And if I ask you to stay? His gaze held hers. Not as royal healer, but as my queen. Nefret was stunned. The priests, the nobles, neighboring kingdoms, they would all object. Let them, Seti replied. Egypt survived a conspiracy. It will survive a queen of uncommon origins. Seti's announcement that he would make Nefret his queen sparked outrage throughout the palace. The high priest questioned whether the gods would bless such a union. The queen mother took to her bed in protest. Foreign ambassadors sent urgent messages home. Even courtiers who had begun to accept Nefret now avoided her, unwilling to be associated with what many viewed as a disastrous decision. The palace buzzes like an overturned beehive, Amenemhat told her. 3 noble families have already departed in protest. That night, Nefret made a painful decision. She packed her simple clothes, left behind all royal gifts, and wrote farewell letters to Seti and Amenemhat. Using the servants' corridors, she slipped out of the palace undetected and boarded a trading vessel bound upriver. As dawn broke, she took one last look at the palace silhouette, believing her sacrifice necessary for Egypt's unity, unaware that Seti had already discovered her absence. The trading vessel had barely reached the first bend in the river when royal chariots appeared along the shore, followed by Seti himself on horseback. "Stop this vessel by command of Pharaoh," shouted Captain Horemheb. Heart pounding, Nefret watched as Seti dismounted and strode aboard, his eyes finding hers immediately among the startled passengers. "You left without saying goodbye," he said quietly. "For Egypt's sake," she explained. "Your kingdom needs unity, not the division my presence causes." "What Egypt needs," Seti replied firmly, "is a queen who puts the welfare of others before her own ambition, even to the point of sacrifice." He took her hands. "I would not rule alongside someone who values politics above love, but I would be honored to share my throne with a woman who loves Egypt enough to leave it." Before the astonished crew and passengers, Pharaoh Seti declared, "I will not return to my palace without you. Choose Nefret of Heka, a future together, or a pharaoh in exile." Word of Seti's dramatic pursuit spread through Egypt faster than the annual flood. The romantic tale of a pharaoh who chased his beloved upriver captured the imagination of common people, who lined the banks to witness their return journey. In the palace, the high priest consulted the oracles, then made a surprising announcement. "The gods have spoken. This union is their will." The Queen Mother, seeing which way the wind blew, suddenly recovered from her illness to help plan the royal wedding. Even foreign ambassadors changed their tone, presenting gifts for the unexpected queen instead of protests. "Politics adapts to power," Amenemhat explained with a wink, "and nothing is more powerful than a love story that inspires the people." When Nefret entered the great temple as Seti's bride, she wore a simple lotus blossom in her hair, a reminder of her village origins amidst the royal regalia. The nobility bowed, accepting if not embracing their new queen. 5 years had passed since that fateful day in the desert. 5 years of challenge and triumph, of resistance overcome and traditions reshaped. Tonight, the palace gardens were silent, save for the gentle splashing of fountains and the distant melodies of nightbirds. Queen Nefret stood beside the lotus pool, her fingers trailing in the cool water as she gazed up at the tapestry of stars stretched across the Egyptian sky. "I thought I might find you here," came Seti's voice from behind her. "You always seek the gardens when something weighs on your mind." She turned with a smile, watching her husband approach. The years of rule had added subtle lines to his face, yet he carried his authority with the same natural grace that had emerged even when he was a nameless stranger in her care. "Our son asked me today why the noble children whisper that his mother once lived in a mud hut," Nefret said, her voice thoughtful rather than troubled. "He's beginning to understand that his parents' union was unconventional." Seti joined her at the pool's edge, their reflections merging on the water's surface. "And what did you tell him?" "The truth, that I was indeed a village healer who found an injured traveler in the desert, not knowing he was Pharaoh." Her eyes met his, "that sometimes the gods place us exactly where we need to be, even when the path makes no sense to us at the time." "Wisdom our son would do well to remember when he sits upon the throne," Seti replied, gently placing a hand on her belly where their second child grew. "As will his sister." Nefret covered his hand with her own. "I received another letter from Heka today. The healing school we established there has trained 30 new practitioners. They're bringing medicine to villages that never had a healer before. Just one of many changes your influence has brought to Egypt," Seti acknowledged. "The nobles who once opposed our marriage now compete for your favor, hoping their daughters might be chosen as handmaidens to the queen who speaks with the common folk's voice." It was true. Despite initial resistance, Nefret had gradually earned respect throughout the kingdom, not by abandoning her origins but by embracing them. Her insistence on understanding the lives of ordinary Egyptians had led to reforms in taxation, justice, and land management that benefited all levels of society. "We've been fortunate," she said softly. "The conspiracies have faded, the harvests have been bountiful, and our neighbors seek alliances rather than conflict. Fortune favors the balanced heart," Seti quoted from ancient wisdom texts. "And Egypt has found its balance between tradition and transformation." He drew her close, his pharaonic dignity momentarily set aside in the privacy of the gardens. "Just as I found mine the day you pulled me from the desert sand." Above them, the stars shone as they had for millennia, witnessing the endless flow of human lives, great and small, royal and common, all part of the same cosmic tapestry. Somewhere among those stars, Nefret knew, the gods who had woven their unlikely paths together were perhaps watching with satisfaction. "Come, my queen," Seti said after a comfortable silence. "Tomorrow brings the festival of renewal, and all of Memphis will look to us for guidance." Hand in hand, they walked back toward the palace, leaving their reflections rippling in the lotus pool. Behind them, a shooting star traced a brilliant arc across the night sky, a divine affirmation of a love that had transformed not just 2 lives, but an entire kingdom. If you enjoyed this emotional tale of destiny, courage, and unexpected love, please hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss another captivating story on our channel. Our storytelling community is growing every day, and your support means everything to us. What was your favorite moment in Nefret and Seti's journey? Was it when she found him dying in the desert, not knowing he was Pharaoh? Or perhaps when he chased her upriver, willing to give up his throne rather than lose her? I'm dying to know which part moved you the most. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever experienced a moment in your own life when fate seemed to guide you to exactly where you needed to be, just like it did for Nefret? Or have you ever had to choose between what society expected of you and what your heart knew was right? Your stories inspire our content, so don't be shy. And if this Egyptian love story stirred your emotions, you absolutely must check out our previous video about star-crossed lovers in ancient Greece. The ending will leave you in tears. I promise it's worth every minute. You can find it linked in the description below. Don't forget to turn on notifications by clicking that bell icon so you're the first to know when we post our next emotional journey through time. Your heart won't want to miss it. Until next time, remember what Seti and Nefret taught us. Sometimes the most beautiful destinies begin with the most unexpected encounters. Keep your hearts open to life's magic, my friends.